The Ghost Children. The snow in that winter of 1987 fell without mercy, laying a pale quilt over the clay roads and the low churchyard. Father Ion Kazaku's breath came out in little clouds as he walked the lane to the orphanage for the 100th time. The door was always locked against him at first light, but he had a key the matron did not know about. Inside, the ward smelled of disinfectant and boiled milk. The rooms were full of small bodies folded into themselves as if the world had taught them to be invisible. The staff called some of the children marionettes or not ours, and the children answered those names by becoming quieter, thinner, less likely to ask for food. Father Ion had begun visiting years before, ostensibly to bless the children. He had seen the ledger pages where administrators checked non-productive and incurable, the handwriting that turned living names into boxes. He had seen the eyes that did not get well cared for and decided, in a way that takes only one person's stubbornness, to be in the world on their behalf. The first child he smuggled out was not one of the numbered ones. She was a pale girl with a cough like a small bell, and when Ion lifted her, she clung to his collar as if she had found a country. He wrapped her in a blanket and told no one. That was how the habit grew. One blanket, then another. A voice in the night arranging a quiet space in the rectory attic. Rumors travel in small places like threads in a tapestry, and soon some of the matron's hands were easier to buy with small favors, and a hospital orderly turned a blind eye in exchange for prayer for his sick mother. Father Ion learned to trade in the currency the regime could not fully police: human sympathy, a promise to remember a name. He learned the routes that did not show on maps: a farmer's back road to the border warehouse, the moonlit rail siding where the freight cars stood empty for hours. He had helpers: a school teacher who forged signatures, a midwife who knew the paths through the mountains, an old lorry driver who hid children in sacks and pretended they were hay. They moved at night, 2 by 2, sometimes 5 by 5, sometimes in batches that made Father Ion's heart beat like a trapped bird. He kept lists in the margins of a Bible, tallying names by the light of a candle. Why 236? The number began as a rumor, a number that grew as the story grew, a monument to what one stubborn heart could gather when the world turned its face away. When he spoke at night to the children huddled beneath blankets, he called them ghosts, only to strip the word of scorn and give it back like a badge. Ghosts who could not be erased because someone remembered them. They were smuggled out in small groups, through hospital releases, through forged paperwork, through the patient work of convincing a family that keeping a disabled child was an act of faith, not folly. Some went to monasteries where the nuns had more mouths than food, but also more courage. Some went to Western charities later, crossing borders in lorries with padded floorboards and prayers. Not every story ended in light. The matron found a baby once and beat 2 men before being driven off. The driver who ferried children to safety did not live to see the spring after one run. Father Ion learned, as everyone in that night learns, that courage asks an account. Bravery exacts a cost. When the winter of change came and the regime's night loosened its grip, the record keepers finally opened the doors, and the outside world saw the leftovers of a policy that had consumed the vulnerable. Some of the children Father Ion had saved were alive, wind-torn and small, but alive. Others had already been carried into rooms the living could not enter. Those who survived carried his name like a talisman. Years later, when the press came and people asked how so many had been hidden, he smiled and said what any good priest would say: he had merely done what his hands could. Names were counted, faces recorded. The myth of 236 grew from the truth of a dozen, then 50, then hundreds, whose lives were touched by a quiet network of connivance and courage. People called them the Ghost Children, not because they had no life, but because the world had tried to make them unseen. Father Ion never asked for praise. He had, in the end, a pile of ragged letters from parents who had kept a child because someone had given them shelter for a night, a photograph or 2 curled at the edges, and a thin folder of forged documents that smelled faintly of smoke. The children called him uncle or father or simply the man with the warm hands. He kept every name. This is a story of a man who would not let children become invisible.